Hello friends, I am Shubhangi Rohatgi, PGT Bio from KV1 AFS Hindit, and I welcome you all to the fourth and final session of chapter 11, Transport in Plants of class 11th. In the last class, we had studied about how do plants absorb water. We studied that how the soil water is taken inside the root hair cells of the plants, and then how is it conducted all the way from the root hair cells to the xylem by the pathways apoplast and symplast. We also studied how this water is then taken up to the great heights of the plants. We studied the role played by root pressure and transpiration pull in the upward movement of water in a plant. In the last part of the session, we discussed in brief about transpiration. What is transpiration? How does it help in pulling up the sap in the xylem, and how is it really important for the plants? We also studied that transpiration also causes some loss to the plants. So, we concluded that transpiration can be said to be a necessary evil for the plants. Moving on with the today's topic, that is translocation. So, we had studied that water is absorbed into the root hair cells mostly by osmosis, and then it is taken up to xylem. Today we will study about the mineral movement, transport of minerals, how minerals are absorbed from the soil into the xylem and how they are taken to the rest of the plant body. We will also see how phloem transport is carried out, how phloem helps in distributing the food to different parts of the plant. Let us begin with the translocation. We saw that diffusion is the process of movement of particles from the region of their high concentration to the region of their low concentration. This is a random movement and it does not involve any expenditure of energy. But diffusion is a very slow process and it can account for only short distance transports. It cannot carry materials over long distances that are seen in large trees. You know, in diffusion, if a molecule is moving across a typical plant, it will take about 2.5 seconds. This is a big number. When we think about the great heights of the trees that are present there, imagine how many years will it take for a molecule to move from soil right to the top of that tree only by diffusion. So, diffusion cannot actually be accounted for large distance transports that occur in the plants. For large distance transports, we have bulk flow systems. Special long distance transport systems are necessary to transport substances across long distances and at much faster rates. In plants, water, minerals and food are generally moved by a mass or bulk flow system. What is this mass flow system or bulk flow system? Let us see. It is the movement of substances in bulk or en masse from one point to another as a result of pressure differences between 2 points. So, this means that at one point the pressure is low, at another point the pressure is high, and then the things will start moving from the one point to another point along the gradient that is created because of differences in pressures. Now, this process is actually different from diffusion, though not much energy directly is used here, but yet it is very different from diffusion. Why? Because here the substances are swept along at the same pace as in flowing river. Now, in diffusion we had studied that the transport of two substances is completely independent of each other. They will move according to their own concentration gradients. If two substances are to diffuse from one region to another, the movement of one substance will not be dependent on movement of other substance. It will depend only on the concentration gradient of the individual substances. But here in mass flow, we see that all the substances are swept along at the same pace. Okay. It can be achieved either through positive or negative hydrostatic pressure gradient. Now, positive pressure gradient means pumping things from one place to another, and negative hydrostatic pressure means sucking things from one place to another. The bulk movement of substances through the conducting tissues is thus known as translocation. So, what is translocation? It is large distance transport of substances over long distances and through conducting tissues. Let us see how mineral nutrients are taken up by the roots and how they are transported. Actually, minerals can be taken in passively as well as actively. Actively means that the cell or the plant will have to spend some energy in the form of ATP to take up that nutrient or mineral from the soil. But the number of minerals or ions that are taken up passively is quite low, though it is there, but as compared to active transport or active uptake of nutrients, it is quite low. As I said that for most minerals, uptake is an active process and it requires energy. Why? Can you think of a reason? The minerals are present in the soil. All the minerals are to be taken from the soil only. Then why does the plant need to spend energy and perform active uptake of the minerals instead of passive? Why? What can be the reason? From your knowledge of active and passive transports, can you think about one important thing? Yes, the need for expenditure of energy or active uptake is that, or must be that, the amount or concentration of that particular mineral should be low in the soil as compared to that present in the root hairs. So, if the concentration of minerals is low in the soil than in the root, then only active transport is to be done. Otherwise, by passive diffusion only, the transport of minerals which are in low concentration outside cannot be taken into inside of the root hairs. Most mineral ions cannot pass through the plasma membrane easily. This is another reason why active transport is done for the mineral ions, because they cannot easily pass through the plasma membrane, then the help of carrier proteins is taken. But few minerals are really taken in passively. Let us study about them in brief. There were some experiments done, and on the basis of observations of these experiments we can conclude that some minerals are uptaken passively. When a plant cell or tissue is transferred from a medium of low salt concentration to a medium of relatively high salt concentration, the tissue absorbs iron rapidly at the initial stages. So, what is being done? First, a plant was placed in a medium of low salt concentration, then it was shifted to a medium of high salt concentration, and then we observed that the rate of absorption of ions increased rapidly initially, but later on the rate became steady. This initial rapid uptake of ions was not seen to be affected by temperature or metabolic inhibitors, that is the poisons. This shows clearly that this rapid initial uptake was not dependent on any living system and it was not involving any metabolic energy. So, which kind of transport system is that which is not dependent on any living system and does not require any metabolic energy? Yes, it is the passive transport system. So, this experiment clearly showed that sometimes some minerals are uptaken by the plants passively. When the plant tissue mentioned above, that is the one on which experiment was conducted, is transferred to a medium of low salt concentration again, some of the ions taken up earlier will diffuse out into the external medium. Again, because of the concentration difference, we can see that the ions which were taken in are now coming out because of the concentration difference between the two mediums, inside of the cell and outside of the cell. This free diffusion of ions through biological membranes according to concentration gradients is passive diffusion. This is what we studied in earlier classes also, and it is one of the major mechanisms of absorption of minerals by the plants. Now, what happens when the concentration of mineral salts is higher in outer solution than the cell sap of the root cells? The mineral salts are absorbed according to concentration gradient by the simple process of diffusion. So, the only one condition required to fulfill for passive transport to happen is that the concentration of mineral ions should be high outside the plant. Then only those mineral ions will diffuse into the plant. It is now known that during passive absorption, the mineral salts may diffuse through cell membranes directly or mainly through the carrier proteins. These carrier proteins, they mediate the passive transport of mineral salts across the membrane, and this system is known as facilitated diffusion. We had studied about facilitated diffusion in earlier class also, that those mineral ions which are able to pass through the plasma membrane easily, they can simply diffuse into the root hair cell. But for those for whom it is very difficult to pass through the plasma membrane, then there are carrier proteins available, and these carrier proteins take those mineral ions from outside to inside of the cell through the mechanism of facilitated diffusion. Here also the transport is along the concentration gradient and the energy is not spent. Another mechanism that is done for transport and uptake of mineral ions is ion exchange. Let us see what is it. Plasma membrane of the root cells is not permeable to all the ions. It is selectively permeable. This is true for all the biological membranes. All the biological membranes are not permeable to all the substances, they are selectively permeable. They allow some to pass through and inhibit the others to come across. All the ions of the same salt are also not absorbed at equal rate, but there is unequal absorption of ions. Some ions will be absorbed fastly, rapidly, while others cannot be diffused so easily. So, the first step in absorption of mineral salts is the process of ion exchange. It does not require any energy and it also facilitates the mineral salt absorption. Let us see how is it done. Ions absorbed into the surface of the cell wall or the membranes of the tissue may be exchanged with ions from external solution in which the tissue is immersed. Suppose, let us see here, if this is a root hair and some ions are present here on the walls. These can be exchanged with those which are present on the outside of the cell, that is present in the external medium. This is known as ion exchange. For example, potassium ions may be exchanged for hydrogen ion absorbed to the surface of the cell membrane. Suppose hydrogen ions are present on the surface of the cell membrane and potassium ions are present outside, then hydrogen ions can be exchanged for the potassium ions. This will help in uptake of potassium ions into the plant. In the same way, anions could exchange with hydroxyl ions. So, the positive ions will be exchanged with the positive ions and negative ions will be exchanged with negative ions only. The ion exchange mechanism allows for a greater absorption of ions from the external medium that could normally be possible by the process of free diffusion. Okay. So, it facilitates in the absorption of ions though they could have been transferred through diffusion also, but with the help of ion exchange the process becomes easier and quicker. Let us move on to the next, mass flow. Mineral ions can also move through roots with the mass flow of water. When water is being taken up, some mineral ions can also move along with the water that is being taken up. It has been shown that an increase in the transpiration causes an increase in absorption of ions. So, we know that transpiration pool is really responsible for uptake of water along the great heights of the trees, but it has been seen that if the transpiration rate is increased, absorption rates of ions are also increased. This means that these ions or minerals are moving along with the water. However, the effect of transpiration on ion absorption could be a direct effect or an indirect effect also. In short, it can be said that if the concentration of minerals is higher in the soil water, the salts are carried up into the xylem elements along with the water through the mechanism of passive absorption. So, this one line here, it summarizes all that we have been discussing up till now, that yes, some mineral ions can be taken up passively without the expenditure of energy, but for that to happen, the one prime requisite is that those ions should be present in the soil in a concentration that is greater than that which is present inside that of the root hair. Also, now these ions can be absorbed by simple diffusion, by facilitated diffusion with the help of ion exchange, or they can also be absorbed along with the water because of the transpiration pool. These are the various mechanisms by which the mineral ions can enter inside the root hair by passive means without the expenditure of energy. Let us move on to the active absorption of the mineral ions. It has often been observed that the cell sap in plants accumulates large quantities of mineral salts against the concentration gradient. Obviously, not always the plant will depend upon the external medium for uptake of mineral ions. Many a times the plant would need to gather large number of ions against their concentration gradient inside its own body. At that time, active transport will be used. The example that we take here is of alga nightella, and the cell sap of nightella, it accumulates potassium ions and phosphate ions to such an extent that their concentrations were thousands and 100 times greater than in pond water in which the plant was growing. So, in this example here, the alga nightella, it is seen to accumulate the potassium and phosphate ions against their concentration gradient. Simple diffusion cannot help in accumulation of ions against the concentration gradients. So, people believe that absorption and accumulation of mineral salts against the concentration gradient is an active process which involves the expenditure of metabolic activity. And how is this energy released? Through respiration. We have many other evidences also which support that some minerals are uptaken by active mechanisms. The factors like low temperature, deficiency of oxygen and metabolic inhibitors which inhibit metabolic activities like respiration in plants also inhibit accumulation of ions. Now, if you remember in the earlier slide we said that if the transport is not being hampered by any of these conditions, temperature differences, oxygen deficiencies or presence of inhibitors, then it means the transport must be passive or it can be diffusion. But if the mechanism of transport is being hampered because of these factors, that means some living things are involved, and these living things we know that are the membrane proteins. Also, it was seen that rate of respiration was increased when a plant was transferred from water to salt solution. This is the mechanism which is known as salt respiration. So, it is now established that active absorption of mineral salts involves the operation of a carrier compound present in the plasma membrane. And these carrier compounds, they use energy for transport of substances. So, this is the active uptake of substances. Why do plants resort to active absorption? Because most of the times plant cells and their organelles require a much higher concentration of minerals and ions than what may be available in water and surrounding soil particles. So, in order to meet these requirements, the plant cells, minerals and ions are constantly absorbed against their concentration gradient using energy. The mechanism of active transport and absorption is influenced by temperature, oxygen concentration and respiratory poisons, that is the metabolic inhibitors. If the temperature is lowered, the rate of active absorption will also be lowered, and if it is raised to large extents, then also the active transport will stop. Then oxygen concentration also interferes with the rate of active transportation. If the oxygen is quite deficient, then the rate of active transport will be lowered, and the metabolic inhibitors or the respiratory poisons, they interfere with the carrier proteins. So, the rate of active absorption is also lowered in presence of these respiratory poisons or inhibitors. The carrier concept. So, if the absorption is through active mechanisms, then that means a carrier should be involved, and this carrier is generally the carrier protein that is present on the plasma membranes. So, according to this theory, the plasma membrane is impermeable to free ions, but some compounds present on it act as carriers and combine with ions to form carrier ion complex, which can move across the membrane. On the inner surface of the membrane, this complex breaks, releasing ions into the cell, while the carrier goes back to the outer surface to pick up fresh ions. We have seen similar diagram in earlier class also. So, suppose this is the outer surface and this is the inner surface of the cell, and this is the plasma membrane. These are the ions which are to be transported inside. So, the ions will get attached to the carrier compound and form a carrier ion complex. This carrier will now undergo some conformational changes, so that it now faces inside of the membrane and the ion will be transported towards the inside. This is how a carrier helps in transportation of ions. Meanwhile, energy in the form of ATP is also used, then only it is known as the active transport. So, what are the structures involved in active transport? First of all, let us talk about the aquatic plants. Aquatic plants, they do not need any special structures for absorption of minerals, for the entire plant body acts as absorptive surface. The whole plant is submerged inside the water. So, now the whole of the plant body can act as absorptive surface to absorb whatever the ions or minerals which are present in the water. But this is not the case for the terrestrial plants. For terrestrial plants, there are elaborate root systems which help in absorption of the mineral ions. As I said, terrestrial plants possess extensive root systems with innumerable growing apices. Short-term radioactive isotope labeling experiments indicate that meristematic regions of the roots absorb greater amount of ions than any other region. So, in fact, even inside the root, not all the portions of the root perform the active absorption at same pace. No, it has been seen with the help of many experiments, it has been established that the meristematic regions are most active in performing the absorption function. Why is it so? Why do you think that meristematic cells are most absorptive? The reason is that these are the cells which need the larger quantities of minerals and ions, for they are always metabolically active. So, since the requirement is higher at those regions, so the absorption is also higher in those regions only. This is what is written here, that this is perhaps necessitated by their active metabolic state. So, in whichever region of the root may the ions must have been absorbed, but eventually they are going to be passed on to the xylem, and from xylem they will be taken along with the water to all parts of the plant body. From xylem elements they move upwards along with transpiration stream and get distributed to all other regions. Ion traffic into the roots. Now, mineral nutrients absorbed from the roots, they are now required to be carried into the xylem. Before moving on to this topic, let us see what we have discussed so far. So, we discussed that if the ions are present in high concentration in soil, this is the plant. If the ions are present in high concentration in the soil, they will be uptaken by diffusion. And this diffusion can be simple diffusion. If the ions are able to pass through the membrane on their own, this can be facilitated diffusion. This can also be aided by ion exchange mechanism, and sometimes the mass flow because of the transpiration pull also helps in diffusion of such ions. Now, the second thing that we saw was if ions are present in low concentration in soil, then their uptake will be aided through active mechanisms. So, there will be active absorption . This active absorption requires the carrier proteins. These carrier proteins are transmembrane proteins . Let me draw a lipid bilayer. This is how we draw a cartoon of a lipid bilayer. For the sake of simplicity, and generally the carrier proteins, they span the plasma membrane. When the molecule to be transported binds to their one end, they undergo conformational changes in such a manner that the molecule to be transported is taken to the inside of the cell and it is released here. So, this is the active absorption, it requires energy and the carrier proteins, and since it is done with the help of carrier proteins, that means it will be affected by temperature, oxygen, whether is it deficient or not, and also presence of inhibitors. This is what we have discussed up till now. Now, whether by passive transport or by active transport, we see that the mineral has been taken inside the root hair cell. It has entered the plant body, but from the root hair cell it needs to be taken to the xylem. Let us see how is it taken to the xylem. So, which is the pathway, what all cells will it have to pass? It will enter the root hair, epidermis, then there will be cortex, then there will be endodermis, and after the endodermis it will enter the stele where it will enter the xylem. Let us see what are the pathways that are involved in this radial movement of the mineral ions. So, there are two pathways. We had studied these pathways earlier also, apoplastic pathway and symplastic pathway. These are the same pathways that we discussed for the transportation of water also. So, in apoplastic pathway, mineral nutrients along with water move from cell to cell through spaces between cell wall by diffusion. The ions which enter the cell wall of the epidermis move across cell wall of the cortex, cytoplasm of the endodermis and cell walls of pericycle and finally reach the xylem. Here everywhere it is written cell wall, but for endodermis we are talking about cytoplasm. Why? Can you recall this from the earlier session? Why the water and minerals cannot travel through the wall of the endodermis even in the apoplastic pathway? Yes, because of the Casparian strips which are highly suberized. So, in symplastic pathway, mineral nutrients entering the cytoplasm of the epidermis, they move across cytoplasm of the cortex, endodermis and pericycle through plasmodesmata and finally reach the xylem. So, this was the diagram we had referred to in earlier session also. This red line shows the symplastic pathway where the water is being taken through the cells, through the cytoplasm and the plasmodesmata, and this is the blue line showing the apoplastic pathway through the cell walls only. And here in epidermis we can see the presence of Casparian strips, and because of this Casparian strip the water can no longer move through the walls only. So, since the active absorption requires energy and protein carriers, also the diffusion or the passive transport is somewhat dependent on some carrier proteins also. There are a lot of factors that affect the absorption of mineral ions from the soil. Let us study a few of them. First of all, soil aeration. How much air or oxygen is present inside the soil? Well, in most of the cases living cells cannot survive without oxygen. Most of the cells are aerobic. As the roots contain a large number of living cells, they require considerable amount of energy for their metabolic activities and growth. We require oxygen for respiration only. So, if we say that oxygen is required, we know that it is required for the metabolic activities, to release energy for the metabolic activities by the process of aerobic respiration. So, oxygen is absolutely essential for generating energy rich components by biological oxidative processes, that means generating ATP. As mineral absorption requires energy, poor soil aeration affects the ability of roots to absorb adequate quantities of minerals. So, if the soil is poorly aerated, the roots will not be able to respire properly and not much energy will be available, and if the energy is not available, then active uptake of mineral ions will not be done. So, this is how poorly aerated soils affect the mineral uptake by the roots. Similarly, waterlogged soils or soils with higher content of clay have very little amount of air, that is, they are the poorly aerated soils, and under such conditions roots are subjected to anaerobic conditions and the absorption of minerals is drastically affected. When they are performing, the roots are performing anaerobic respiration, the amount of energy produced will be quite low, and this energy will not be sufficient to meet the requirements for active uptake of minerals from the soil. The inhibition of absorption of minerals due to the effect of respiratory poisons on roots clearly suggests that the absorption of minerals is an energy dependent process. Now, this is not only a hypothesis, it has been experimentally proven also that uptake of minerals by the roots is an energy dependent process, and if sufficient amount of oxygen is not available, sufficient energy will be not available to the root, and hence the active uptake of minerals will be hampered. Moving on, the temperature. The second factor that affects the rates of absorption is the temperature. Soil temperature has a significant effect on roots metabolic activities, and also it affects the mobility of ions in the soil. If the temperature of soil is lowered, absorption of minerals will be drastically reduced. But with the increase in temperature, the rate of absorption also increases, but only up to certain limits. Can you think of something similar? Have you studied some similar effects of temperature elsewhere also, where lowering the temperature is inhibiting or lowering down the rate of some reaction, and then when you increase the temperature, the rate of reaction increases to some extent, but later on if you keep on increasing the temperature, the reaction comes to a stop. Have you studied about such effects of temperature elsewhere also? Yes, in enzymes. So, the proteins work this way with different temperatures. Drastic variations in the rate of absorption due to changes in temperature suggest the process is dependent on protein or enzymatic activity. This variation that we see in the rates of absorption with changing temperature, it clearly indicates that some proteins are involved in active uptake of the mineral ions. Next thing that affects the rate of absorption of mineral ions from the soil is the pH of the soil. Again, we know that the pH alters the activity of the proteins by altering their 3D structure. So, similarly, the changing pH can influence the way the carrier proteins work, and hereby it will affect the rate at which active absorption takes place. The degree of ionization of minerals and other nutrients, it depends upon the hydrogen ion concentration of the soil solution. For example, most of the phosphate ions at alkaline pH exist either as bivalent or trivalent ions. Such ions are not favored for absorption. So, the pH determines what type of ions will be present in the soil. Suppose the soil is alkaline, then the phosphate ions will be present in bivalent or trivalent forms, and these will not be easily absorbed. On the other hand, neutral pH favors the absorption of monovalent ions. So, when the pH is neutral, monovalent ions are easily absorbed. This shows that soil pH has a significant effect not only on the rate, but also the kinds of ions uptake. This property is also due to its effect on protein components that are involved in absorption. So, the changing rates of absorption with changing pH is because of the proteins involved in active absorption, that is the carrier proteins. As protein structure is very sensitive to pH, its function also changes if there is any change in the pH. That is why the maintenance of proper soil pH is very important in agriculture. Too acidic or too alkaline soil is virtually useless for cultivation. What is the problem associated with excessive use of fertilizers in our crop fields? How do they affect the pH of the soil? Please find about it and try to correlate your findings with the things that we have discussed here, how pH affects the mineral absorption of the soils. Sometimes it so happens that even if the soil is very rich in nutrients, yet it is not able to give us good crop, and one of the reasons that can be present can be the pH of soil. Either the soil can be too acidic or too alkaline, and in both the conditions the soil will not give us a good crop. Moving on, the next thing that affects the rate of absorption is concentration of soil solution, that is the concentration of ions that are to be absorbed. Generally, the concentration of minerals and its components found in soil solution is far below the levels of the same found in cell sap. Yes, in the roots or in the cells, the concentration of mineral ions is generally very high as compared to that present in the soil, that is the external medium. It means that the absorption of ions takes place against the concentration gradient. This is what we have been discussing so far. The relative concentration of ions found in the cell sap and soil solution gives the absorption ratio. As these relative concentrations keep on changing, so does the rate of absorption also change. Now, talking about the ocean water, which is highly concentrated. Ocean water contains relatively great amount of salts than that of fresh waters. So, can the land plants can be taken in ocean water and made there to grow? Obviously not. The land plants which are adapted to grow in freshwater soils die in marine water. Why? What will the greater salt concentration do to such plants? What will happen? If you remember, in the last class we had studied that if the plant tissues are kept in concentrated salt solutions, what happens? Plasmolysis occurs. The salt solution, it sucks out the moisture from the plant body and the plant can die if it is subjected to extremely high concentrations of salt water. So, the land plants which are adapted to grow in freshwater soils die in marine water. Why? Because the marine water is enriched with greater amount of metal ions and this condition is physiologically dry for them. That is, they can be dried out. But it is not so that plants do not grow in marine water. Some plants are specially adapted to grow inside the marine conditions. So, marine plant cells which have been adapted to such water, what do? They contain much more ionic contents than found in sea water. So, in order to prevent the plasmolysis or drying out of the plant body because of presence of excessive salts outside, what does the plant do? Plant accumulates high concentration of salts inside its body also in order to balance out, so that the water does not move out through osmosis. Even here the ions are absorbed against the concentration gradient. The rate of absorption of ions vary and depends on the concentration of soil solution. Normally, roots absorb greater amounts of ions at greater rate in dilute solutions than in relatively high concentration solutions. Obviously, the steeper is the concentration gradient, the more faster the absorption will take place. If the external medium contains low amount of salts and inside the cell sap there is high concentration of salt solutions, the movement will be at faster rates. However, if the external medium also contains a concentrated solution, then the rate at which absorption is taking place will not be that high. Moving on, ion-ion interactions. Soil solutions consist of a wide variety of ions in different concentrations. While root absorbs inorganic nutrients, the ions of one kind present in the solution either facilitate or interfere with the uptake of other kinds of ions. This is known as antagonisms. On the other hand, some species of ions can also help in uptake of some ions. This is known as ion facilitated uptake. Epstein had demonstrated that absorption of potassium and iron is antagonized by presence of calcium and magnesium ions. And similarly, calcium chloride, it inhibits the uptake of copper ions. On the other hand, sodium chloride facilitates the uptake of wide variety of ions. Such ion interactions is explained on basis of carrier molecules. We studied about antipodes and sympads, we are talking about them here only. So, because of specific binding site, any ion that competes with other ion for the same site results in antagonism. On the other hand, a particular ion binding to carrier molecule facilitates the binding of specific ion and enhance uptake of the said ion. So, the kind of ions that are present in the soil also determine the rate of absorption. Talking about the translocation of mineral ions, they are translocated through the xylem vessel along with the water. So, translocation is aided by transpiration, and water is taken up by transpiration pull. So, the minerals are also taken up by transpiration pull. Chief sinks for mineral elements are the growing regions and the storage organs. So, this is where the mineral elements are taken. And how are they unloaded from the veins? It is done by diffusion and even the active uptake by the cells. Now, once the minerals reach their destination, it is not so that they are always kept there. They are also remobilized, especially from the older parts which are going to die. So, before dying, they try to remobilize almost all the minerals and move them to the younger parts. Similarly, before leaf fall in deciduous plants also, minerals are removed. But those minerals which are structural components, they are very difficult to be remobilized, they are not remobilized. Also, it is seen that the xylem and the phloem, they are not watertight compartments. It is not so that xylem carries only inorganic nutrients while phloem carries only organic materials. Many observations have made this clear that xylem and phloem are not watertight compartments, they can carry different things also. Talking about the phloem transport. Now, we know that phloem carries food. This food is taken from the leaves to storage organs in summers, and when the seasons have changed, suppose it is early spring, now the storage organ, suppose root, it will act as a source and the food will now be taken to the growing parts to let, for example, the buds. So, this is the bidirectional transport in the phloem. The source is the place from where the phloem is being loaded and sink is the place where the phloem is being unloaded. The sugar or sucrose is being taken to that point. This is known as sink and it will vary according to the seasons. During the plant's growth period, that is the spring, storage organs mobilize the sugar towards the growing areas which are the sinks. What does the phloem sap contain? It contains water and sucrose, other sugars, hormones and even the amino acids. It has been said that the phloem translocation takes place through mass flow. Let us see what is the mass flow hypothesis. It says that it is the best theory to explain the movement of sap through the phloem. It was given by Munch, that is why it is also known as the Munch hypothesis. It says that the translocation of organic solutes takes place en masse through phloem along a gradient of turgor pressure from the region of high concentration of soluble solutes to the lower concentration. What happens that when there is high concentration of substances, especially sugar, inside the cells at the source, diffusion gradient is created because of which the water draws inside the cells. And now this water takes the materials because of development of hydrostatic pressure to the sink. This diagram will explain what exactly happens. Suppose these are two systems, this X contains the high sugar, these are semi-permeable membranes, this Y is the place where sugar is present in low quantities. So, this is the source, this is the sink. Because of osmosis, water will enter inside the X bulb, and when the sufficient amount of water has entered the X bulb, the pressure will cause the net movement of water towards the Y bulb. This is how the phloem transport takes place from the source to the sink. So, this is what happens. Let us draw. Suppose this is the source, this is the source cell. By active transport, sugars are loaded inside the phloem. ATP was used in this. So, with the help of active transport, sugar was loaded into the source cell. Now, the water will also move in. Because of movement of water, a pressure develops and this causes the bulk flow. This movement of water causes the bulk flow, and the sugars, they along with the water reach the sink areas. Now, in the sink areas again ATP will be consumed for unloading, and this way the phloem helps in transport of sugars or sucrose from the source to the sink with the mass flow. This is the diagram that is given in your NCERT also. This diagram here indicates the movement of phloem sap towards the growing buds and towards the storage organ, that is the root. So, sometimes this can be the sink, other times this can be the sink. The main thing that you have to remember is that phloem loading and phloem unloading both are energy dependent processes. The girdling experiments and the effort experiment, these show that this theory is quite correct and is able to explain the flow of solutes inside the phloem. So, this aphid experiment is very famous. The aphid insect, it can penetrate into the phloem, and we see that since the phloem sap is moving at a pressure, when a hole is made here, we can see the phloem sap coming out, oozing out of this hole. We need to use aphids here because otherwise if we drill a hole in the phloem, it makes it clogged, but aphids have mechanism to prevent this clogging. The girdling experiment also explains that yes, phloem carry the photosynthetes. What do we do in girdling experiments? See here, the bark is removed along with the phloem. So, after some time we see that the food material, it is accumulated here, and in the long run the plant will die because of lack of the food material. Now, we had earlier also discussed that xylem transport is unidirectional, but translocation through phloem is multidirectional. Also, it consumes energy and it is dependent on the living cells, which is not the case for the xylem also. This was all about the chapter, and you should be able to attempt the questions that are given in the end of your books. Try to solve them. We have discussed all the portions of the chapter in thorough detail. I hope you enjoyed learning.